What's up, Foxden? Fox here, and today I'm talking about the unsung hero of Intel. Join the Foxden Discord down below. And if you like my content, consider subscribing. Everybody knows by now that Intel's 11th generation is pretty bad, and Intel has been losing to Ryzen quite considerably over the past few years that Ryzen has been on top. With that said, there is a generation that stood above the rest from Team Blue, and that was Intel's 10th generation of CPUs. It wasn't because they were the best, in fact they were far from it, about 2 cores worth, but what they lacked in nanometers they made up for in pricing. Back in the day, we used to say that Ryzen was the budget alternative if you couldn't afford Intel, but these days those roles are reversed. And that's perfectly okay. In fact, I think it was a sound strategy for the 10th generation of Intel, since they knew they couldn't win against the 3900X, to just make their cheaper chips cheaper. So I'm going to be doing an in-depth analysis of almost every single CPU in this generation, excluding laptop CPUs, as well as variants that I'll either touch on or not talk about at all. Particularly the T variants of any of these will probably not be mentioned because low power chips are for a very specific user base that is very niche and aren't generally meant for gamers. And the way I'll be ranking these chips in this list is based on value. So price to performance, what are you getting for the money? So this doesn't mean that the most expensive 10900K is going to be number 1 on the list, while the Celeron is going to be at the bottom of the list. But despite that, the Pentium G5900 is the worst thing you can possibly pick up right now. If it ever actually retailed for the price Intel suggested, about $42, it would be a bit of a different story, but 2 cores and 2 threads is not enough. And with this CPU generally sitting around the $60 price range, for $5 more you can get a Pentium instead. The Celeron G5900 has absolutely no place in 2021, and Intel really needs to think about either changing their Celerons or getting rid of them entirely. You cannot use Windows 10 on this thing, and even if Windows 11 is lighter, I do not think 2 cores and 2 threads will be enough to do anything. Back in the day, the Celeron was the optimal choice for people's grandmas, but these days if you use the Celeron G5900 in your grandma's PC, chances are you would be charged for a homicide because using this CPU would probably shave years off her life. And now it's time for probably one of my most unpopular opinions, aside from the fact that the Suicide Squad new movie was bad. For second place in worst value possible, the Intel Core i7 10700K, one of the most popular lineups because of the K in the title, is terrible in terms of value. And I can already feel the dislikes coming. I get it. You probably have this in your system and you're angry, but hear me out. For $70 more, you can get the i9 10850K, which is an overclockable 10-core 20-thread chip. Or you can save your money, save $70 for a Core i7 10700, with the only difference being core clock and the ability to overclock. And I understand what overclocking is for a lot of people. It's a very niche hobby, but a lot of people enjoy it. With that said, Intel's using that naivety for its advantage. Again, even just using Best Buy's retail price, this costs $350, whereas the base 10700 costs $290. So the amount of savings you can get just by taking the K off the name and being willing to not overclock is absolutely insane. So please consider choosing something else other than the 10700K. If you really wanted to overclock, you should just go for Ryzen instead. Coming up next is what I call mid-range mediocrity. The 11600K does the exact same thing the 10700K does. However, as of right now, regular Core i5 10600 is actually retail more, but back in the day they were a little bit cheaper. However, it wasn't nearly as drastic as the 10700K to the 10700. The 10600K isn't an absolute terrible value if you really wanted to get into overclocking, but again, going for a cheaper alternative that still has 6 cores and 12 threads like the i5 10400, or spending extra to get the i7 10700, both seem like better options than getting the 11600K. I can feel the dislikes coming. This isn't obviously fact. If you're in a place where the 10600K costs completely differently, or you have some reasoning that you really wanted the 10600K, then just go for it. But with that said, coming in at the 4th worst value CPU you can get is the Intel Core i9 10900K. If you wanted to be the absolute best of the best for gaming performance, the 10900K was just barely the winner compared to the 12-core, 24-thread 3900X from Ryzen. But here's the real kicker. Ryzen didn't kill the 10900K, Intel killed the 10900K, and the 10900 by releasing the 10850K. You can save $110 by going with the 10-core, 20-thread 10850K, which you can feasibly overclock to the same core clock as the 10900K. They're both 5.2 gigahertz boost clock out of the box, and the 10900 in between the two only has a core clock of 2.7 gigahertz. So either go with the overclockable 10850K, or if you just need a power trip, then go for the 10900K. And this is where the list diverges from worst value to mediocre value, and this starting off is the Pentium G6400. Now a CPU like this shouldn't be used with anything more than a GTX 970 if you are planning to game. However, the reason why I consider this to be a good value is you are getting 2 cores and 4 threads, which is much better for gaming than 2 cores and 2 threads for about the same price. Like I said earlier, give or take $5 from the Celeron for much better performance. Now this is something I would give grandma. Although it isn't the fastest thing in the world, for everyday browsing it's perfectly fine, and like I said, in some games if you're pairing it with a mid-range to low-end GPU, this thing will absolutely do fine. You will have stutters in games as 4 cores become more and more dominant, but if you prefer some older titles or are willing to sacrifice some stutters, then I think that this actually was a very good surprise, and when I bought it and tested it, I enjoyed it quite a lot. With that said, I think there is something to note here. Although this isn't a league of its own for being so cheap at $64, if you are an extreme gamer on a budget, the Ryzen 2200G for about $40 more gives you a pretty solid GPU as well, so you can save money that way. But with that said, the Pentium G6400 is in an absolute league of its own, and it was very impressive when it came out. And I will not be covering any other Pentiums on this list because the Pentium G6500 and 6600 should just be avoided at all costs. Both of those cost about as much as an i3-10100 and will do much worse because the i3-10100 has 4 physical cores and 8 threads compared to the 2 cores and 4 threads of all Pentiums in this lineup. And with that said, up next on our list of decent value to actually I would consider this to be the first great value chip is the Core i3-10100. It's not going to run an RTX 3080. Hell, I think it pairs best with a 1660 or even a 1650 or a 1060. You're getting 4 cores and 8 threads at around $110. And if you can find a 10100F, you can save $10 if you plan to have a GPU in your system. What's absolutely mind-boggling to me is you can get about the same performance of an i7 7700, which is one of the top-of-the-line CPUs 4 years ago, for $110 in the i3-10100F. Absolutely consider getting this as a low-end gamer. This is one of the CPUs that really does make it hard to go back and say buy an old 4770K unless you can find a very good price on both the motherboard and the CPU. Having the 10100 means that not only can you have a motherboard that will upgrade all the way up to the 11900K, but it's just also a very good performer. The only unfortunate thing is you can't overclock it. This is great, even if you just wanted to try to get into video editing or Photoshop, having these 4 cores and 8 threads is actually very nice for that. It won't handle 4K workloads or Blender or anything close to that, but I think this is a fantastic all-rounder and one Intel chip that I would actually recommend from the 10th generation. And up next is the Core i7-10700. For all the reasons the 10700K failed. The Core i7-10700 retails for only $280, which, like I said, is $70 cheaper than the K variant, and performs admirably. You could pair this CPU with an RTX 3080 and probably do just fine. definitely a 3070. 8 cores is going to be fantastic for video editing, even in 4K workloads. It will absolutely shred any everyday task, Blender render, or anything you could put up against it. This was an absolute value proposition out of nowhere. I cannot believe just how competitively priced this 10700 was, because usually the Core i7 series are the more premium versions of Intel's chips, but the fact that they brought these down in price were absolutely fantastic, and having them be at that price point just puts it in a league of its own. Generally speaking, a Ryzen 6 core costs more than this. So being able to have 8 Intel cores, which still do very, very well in single-threaded performance as well as multi-core performance, just makes sense. As you get up to the Core i9 series, Ryzen takes over, but right here, I think a Core i7 10700 is something I would recommend, even compared to some of Ryzen's offerings in this price range. In fact, it's what's in my test bench right now. It runs very cool as well. You can run it on a stock cooler with no issues. And again, if you can find a 10700F, you may be saving yourself $10 if you plan to have this with a GPU. Notably speaking, the Core i3 series, the other two CPUs in that lineup, the 10300 and 10320 are just too close in price to the 10400 to be considered when you can get a 6-core processor for around the same price. And this is where the best CPU comes in. The Core i5 10400 is going to hold a special place in my heart, which is not something Intel has done recently. The last time I remember loving Intel was the i7 7700K. But the Core i5 10400 put 6 cores in a price range that had a 1 at the start of its 3 numbers. For $190, a 6-core and 12-thread processor is unheard of. It didn't need to be the best 6-core CPU, and it wasn't. It was pretty bad comparatively to all the other options. But for 6 cores, 12 threads at $189.99, it just needed to exist. And it existed very, very well. You could run it on a stock cooler just fine, and you could run a 2070 Super on it without having any issues with microstutter or anything like that. The Core i5 10400 was an absolute beast, and it is one of my favorite Intel CPUs of all time. I would even recommend it, if it saves you money, to pick this over the 11400. And one of the best things that Intel does is memory. And this sounds bad because I know that a lot of people are angry at Intel because of the fact that they do lock out higher speeds on some motherboards. With that said, the way Intel utilizes RAM speeds is much better than Ryzen. So using a budget CPU like the Core i3 10100 or 10400 means that you can actually go pretty cheap with your RAM, and it won't affect performance nearly as much as it would on Ryzen. On top of that, I think this is the entry-level thing you should get for video rendering. I don't know how well it performs in 3D renders, but I think that for video editing and Photoshop, this thing will handle absolutely everything you throw at it because of the amount of cores that it has. So that's my list. I missed a few CPUs if you didn't notice, notably the Core i5 10500. That's because they were only really ever found in desktop PCs that were already made. It's not bad. If you can get it in a cheap enough PC, it's fine. It's going to be like the 10400, just slightly better, but it's something I don't really care about. And I did make passing mentions of the Core i3s and the Pentiums. Again, none of them are worth talking about except for the ones I mentioned in this, just because they outprice themselves too easily. And I did miss the G5920. I'm going to be honest with you, Chief. Don't buy that one either. Again, it's going to cost more than the Pentium G6400, and the G6400 is going to perform way better. So thank you so much for watching this video about my favorite generation of Intel processors in recent years. If you liked it, like, subscribe, do what you usually do, and as always, buy yourself something nice.